Good evening. Hello, hello. We are, for those, we have a couple people who don't normally come and worship with us. So just letting y'all know, we do once a month on Sunday evening, we're doing a survey of a book of the Bible. And so we're moving along, and that's what we're continuing on today. Today's survey is going to be, we're going to combine Ezra and Nehemiah together. And that might seem a little redundant. Many of you are in the class that we just finished on Ezra and Nehemiah on Wednesday night. But there are, of course, some who, those who haven't been here. But you can think of this as sort of a review or maybe a capstone to that particular class. Just so we can be reminded of some of the lessons that these two books had to teach us. We did First and Second Samuel together. We did First and Second Kings together. We did First and Second Chronicles together. And so now it seems appropriate to combine these two books. They are the same book in the Hebrew Scriptures, and they cover a multitude, they cover a similar period of time, rather. Ezra and Nehemiah do. And they both have a similar focus. Again, we just finished our class on these books, so there isn't much new that I can present. But we will be reminded of several things, and it is good to review these things on occasion. And of course, it spans the period when the Jews have returned from exile. There are three main time periods that are under consideration here, as we'll discuss when we get especially to the date. The Jews are allowed to return from their exile, from their Babylonian exile in 538 BC, and that's how Ezra starts. And we see during that time period, through the first 6 chapters of Ezra, we see the governorship of one Zerubbabel. Then the leadership of Ezra we'll see in chapters 7 through 10, and then Nehemiah's time as governor in the book of Nehemiah. So we'll survey these books and hopefully have a greater understanding, or perhaps a review of the understanding that we had in our class. The names of these books, of course, there's the pattern for the books of Old Testament history, that they are typically named after either the writer or the central character of the book. And it is true with Ezra, although the central character, he's only the central character for only half of the book, 7 through 10. But Nehemiah is, of course, the central character of the entire book of Nehemiah. Ezra's name means help, while Nehemiah's name's comfort of the Lord, or comfort of Yahweh. So, in essence, these people, if they live up to their namesake, are meant to be a help to Israel. They're meant to be a comfort, or relaying the comfort of God upon the people. Interestingly enough, in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, they are both called Second Esdras, essentially. The second book, basically Second Ezra. And apparently the first Ezra is an apocryphal work. So that's just an interesting tidbit there. The Latin Vulgate calls Ezra Liber Primus Estrae, and Nehemiah Liber Secundus Estrae, which is again First and Second Ezra. So as you see, since they are treated together in other compilations, they serve well. It serves us well to treat them together in this survey. Let's consider the authors and the date of these books. Again, the events of both books range from about 538 BC to sometime after 432 BC. So the time period of about 100 years. Ezra is the traditional writer of the book that bears his name, and he shows up in both the second half of Ezra, and he also shows up in the book of Nehemiah. No one really disputes that Ezra wrote his book, and no one really disputes that Nehemiah wrote his book either, and so that shall stand. First-person pronouns are found throughout Nehemiah, indicating who the writer is in his book as well. In both Ezra and Nehemiah, we see that. Well, mainly in Nehemiah. Ezra chapters 1 through 6 takes place from 538 BC to 515 BC, though there is evidence that parts of Ezra 4 takes place around 465 BC, so a little bit later. In Ezra chapters 7 through 10, that takes place in about 458 to 457 BC. So mainly in 458, but it carries on into the next year, 457. Nehemiah chapter 1 takes place in 445 BC, while most of the rest of the book, up through chapter 13, verse 3, takes place in the year 444. There are some records in Nehemiah during those chapter 2 through 13:3. There are some records that track back to 538 BC, all the way back. And then there are also some records that look forward and seemingly all the way to 330 BC. So all the way 100 years or more after Nehemiah was around. And of course, Nehemiah's initial governorship lasts from 444 to 432 BC. So about 12 years. The portion after Nehemiah 13:4, takes place sometime after 432 BC. I know you're writing down all these numbers, right? They're making sense, right? There's a lot of numbers. I recognize a lot of dates that are considered here. But it gives you some time frame for all these happenings that take place. And I think it's important to understand the dates and to understand that there is a certain point in time, a period in time that these things actually did take place, and a period in time that we can correspond with other events in history. And so it's important to consider some of these things. I know I'm kind of rattling them off right now. The writing of Ezra must take place sometime after, or sometime during the lifetime of Ezra. So this book had to have been finished in 457 BC or later. So that would be, so he lived around that time. Nehemiah's book has to have been finished mostly by 430 BC. Again, some scribal additions may have been included as late as 330 BC, because there are some indications that might be the case if Josephus is to be believed. Nehemiah's book, I already said that. Some might think that might present a problem to inspiration, but I disagree. If a scribe were inspired to make those scribal additions, who are we to argue with that? The primary audience of these books, just as with Chronicles, these books were written to encourage those who were in Israel at this time. The Jews were encouraged were discouraged from the harassment given to them by the nations around them, particularly the Samaritans, as we see in Ezra chapter 4. We also see in the entire book of Nehemiah, Sanballat the Horonite very well may have been a Samaritan, and so he is an adversary of Nehemiah, along with Tobiah the Ammonite. So there are these individuals, these people representative of their nations, who cause issues for the Jews at this time. Well, they worked hard, the Samaritans especially, and some of the others, worked hard to prevent them from building their temple. When that failed, they tried to prevent them from building up the city. Those efforts continued on into Nehemiah's tenure as governor as well. It also shows their faithfulness, the faithfulness of the Jews, at least in certain areas, and of course their lack of faithfulness in others. We'll continue more when we look at the themes of this book and how that plays out. It shows their struggles in maintaining faithfulness and learning the lessons taught by the examples of their fathers. There's so many important lessons to be learned from these books, but getting this basic introduction and the outline, we'll get the outline in a second, but who writes it and the primary audience and the dates are help us to solidify in our mind that where this takes place in Bible history. The outline, as we discussed in our class, the first 6 chapters, we can think of as sort of a second Exodus. They are brought out of the Babylonian captivity, just as the Israelites are brought out of Egyptian bondage, and they come into the land that was promised to their fathers. In Ezra chapter 1, the book begins where Second Chronicles leaves off with a decree given by King Cyrus the Great of Persia, who had just conquered Babylon in 539 BC. This decree gives the Jews permission to return to their homeland, again, after the Babylonians had brought them into that captivity. So in chapter 2, they in fact go. We can see a listing of the people who left. Ezra chapter 3, the first thing they work on, and this is always is amazing to consider, the first thing that they work on is they build an altar to worship God. They celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles at this time, and then they lay the foundation of the temple. And that's a huge thing that we see there. When the foundation is laid, we see in Ezra chapter 4 that the Samaritans, they vie the Persian kings to prevent them from continuing to build. Eventually, in Ezra chapters 5 and 6, during the reign of Darius the Great and the urging of the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, 17 years after the foundation was laid, they finally begin rebuilding the temple again. They complete it in about 4 years, it seems. And they celebrate the Passover for the first time since the temple had been rebuilt. Again, many allusions that we see to the Exodus story, to when they come out of Egyptian bondage, they come out of Babylonian captivity, and they come and they build what God had told them to build: the tabernacle in Exodus, the temple in Ezra, and they build it and they worship God, honoring God with the Passover and with the other feast days that they had they were commanded to celebrate. And later in chapter 4, so there's part of chapter 4 takes place with the rest of the story, and then much of chapter 4 takes place later. Later in chapter 4, the Samaritans get King Artaxerxes I to prevent the Israelites from rebuilding the walls of the city as well. And probably when Artaxerxes becomes king in 465 BC. Well, in between chapters 6 and 7, the events of Esther take place, and we're not going to cover that today. But that is the reign of King Ahasuerus. Historians call him King Xerxes I, and he is the king at this time. And so now we see in chapters 7 through 10, during the reign of the following king, Artaxerxes, some interesting things happen. Ezra, he's introduced here in chapter 7, and we see his reformations being set in place in chapters 7 through 10. He has permission from King Artaxerxes to go to Jerusalem for their benefit in 458 BC. Chapter 8 shows his arrival there with some resistance from his own people, but they arrive safely, despite refusing military escort. In chapter 9, Ezra learns of unauthorized marriages among the people and prays for the Lord for forgiveness, or prays to the Lord for forgiveness. These marriages were to pagans who would eventually lead the people in the wrong way, lead them to apostasy. And it was a major issue that hurt the people. And it goes all the way back to the time of King Solomon, perhaps even further, but certainly Solomon was one of the most egregious individuals to have violated this command, marrying many foreign women and turning his heart from serving the true God to serving idols. And certainly that was the case with Solomon, and that could very well end up being the case for the Israelites should they continue down this path. So in chapter 10, they remedy the issue, having the men who married these pagan women divorce their foreign wives. In Nehemiah, chapters 1 through 6, Jerusalem's wall is rebuilt. Some time passes between the end of Ezra and the beginning of Nehemiah. We're not sure if the wall had been rebuilt by this point. It certainly seems like that hasn't been the case. Regardless, it is dilapidated in the time at the beginning of Nehemiah. And so there is an issue here. In 445 BC, 12 years after the events of Ezra chapter 10, Nehemiah, the king's cupbearer, hears of the state of the walls in Jerusalem, and he mourns. In chapter 2, he asks Artaxerxes, who is still king at this time, if he can go and take care of these things. He's given permission. He goes to survey the city, dealing with initial opposition. In chapter 3, they begin rebuilding the walls. And in chapter 4, they face more fierce opposition. And they begin to set up their own defense. In chapter 5, while the walls are being rebuilt, the wealthier Jews oppress the poorer Jews. And Nehemiah sets that right. He makes it right so that they are no longer doing this, showing what his governorship was to be like, that he is supposed to be a good governor. In chapter 6, the oppression reaches its peak. The oppression of the foreign adversaries reaches its peak when the enemies conspire to kill Nehemiah. And he resists, and construction of the walls is finally completed by the end of the chapter. In chapters 7 through 13, we see reforms and restorations. Chapter 7, we see the proper people are appointed for various activities in Jerusalem. We see a record of the people who had come, repeating much of what we see in Ezra chapter 2. In Nehemiah 8, chapter 8, Ezra reads the law. Probably chapters 8, 9, and 10 are a very important section here. He reads the law to the people. They celebrate the Feast of the Tabernacles once again. And the text says it was the greatest since Joshua. The covenant is renewed. The covenant is renewed in Nehemiah chapter 10, and it's sealed, or chapter 9, and sealed in chapter 10. And in chapter 11, they draw lots to decide who would live in Jerusalem among the people. Apparently, Jerusalem at this time, not a whole lot of people were living there. It was not very densely populated at all, as we see in chapter 7. So in chapter 11, they're like, well, we got to bring people in, so they draw lots, and they get people to come and to live there. Chapter 12 begins with a list of the high priests, and even lists them up to perhaps even through 330 BC, if Josephus is to be believed. In Nehemiah chapter 12, they have a dedication ceremony or later in chapter 12, they have a dedication ceremony for the city's rebuilt walls. And finally, in chapter 13, Nehemiah had left for a while. We see in between chapters 3 and 4 that he left for a while, verses 3 and 4. And then he returns and finds many of his and Ezra's reforms seemingly undone, including most notably the issue of pagan marriages, even to the point where some of the children who were products of these marriages didn't even understand the Hebrew language. They only spoke the languages of the foreign nations around them. Nehemiah sets them right, and he desires to be remembered for good. So what are the themes of these books? The themes of this is the most, if you don't remember anything from these lessons, remember the themes. Remember the themes, because this is where the important stuff is. Well, it's all important. The more important stuff. The more applicable stuff. The themes are of remembrance. The themes are of remembrance. The first, remember the covenant. Remember the covenant. The Jews at this time had been in captivity for at most 70 years. Many had not been able to keep the ceremonial law for a long time since the destruction of the temple, or even since they were carried out of the land, because they were carried out in waves all the way back to the beginning of, or near the beginning of the reign of Jehoiakim. And so at that point, many people, and that's when Daniel begins. So they have a bunch of waves in which they're taken out of the land, and many of those, especially the faithful like Daniel, aren't able to worship, and at least not in the way that the Old Testament tells them to. They aren't able to worship in those ways, and it would seem, while they were in Babylon, that they mostly kept to themselves. But when they returned to the land, they started to engage in the same habits of their forefathers who were cast out, namely in the practice of pagan marriages. This led the people toward perhaps apathy, and eventually would have led them to apostasy. Apathy in the sense where, well, we're facing opposition, so we're going to quit building this thing, building this temple, building these walls. We're facing this. We're not gonna do this. There's that apathy involved there, and eventually it would lead to apostasy. It would lead to turning away. Ezra and Nehemiah both had to set that right, along with the prophets that were contemporary with them, like Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Re-engaging in the Jewish feast days and reading the law reminded them of the covenant that they were to follow. It was difficult for them due to the adversaries that they were facing. But this book shows us that we need to remember such things, and that remembering them, we should remember them no matter the opposition that we face. For us, we need to remember our covenant. They had the Old Covenant. They had the Old Testament to remember. We have the New Covenant. Now, that doesn't mean we need to forget the Old Testament. There are a lot of wonderful lessons to learn there, but we can't forget what we see in the New Testament either. This New Testament, the New Covenant of Jesus Christ. We need to remember our, quote, feast days, or rather the worship that we engage in when we come together on the first day of the week. And as Paul wrote to Timothy in 1 Timothy 4:13, give attention to reading, to exhortation, to doctrine. Remember these things. Remember, and that these are ways in which we can remember the covenant. Remember the law that God has given to us. Remember the covenant is the first one. The second one, remember the consequences. Remember the consequences of falling from that covenant, from breaking that covenant. If we remember the consequences of sin, hopefully the ideal is that it will help us to avoid that sin. They had just come out of the punishment that God had brought upon this people for their sin while they had kings. And they were reminded, we see in Ezra's prayer, in Ezra chapter 9. I will turn there. In Ezra chapter 9, Ezra chapter 9, verse 13, and after all, maybe a little bit back, verse 12. Now therefore, do not give your daughters as wives for their sons, nor take their daughters for your sons, and never seek their peace or prosperity, that you may be strong and eat good of the land, and leave it as an inheritance to your children forever. Verse 13. And after all that has come upon us, for our evil deeds and for our great guilt, since you, our God, have punished us less than our iniquities deserve, and have given us such deliverance as this, should we again break your commandments and join in marriage with the people committing these abominations? Would you not be angry with us until you had consumed us, so that there would be no remnant or survivor? So we have, and that's verses 13 and 14 mainly. So we have the idea that the concept, they had just come out of this land. They had just finished the punishment that they had given. It's like someone just coming out of a 10-year prison sentence. Man, I am free, and then going back and robbing a bank. That's it. That's the kind of thing that these people were engaging in, right? Ridiculous. Why haven't you learned your lesson here? Of course, sometimes I have to wonder if the kids learn their lessons whenever something like that happens, because they do that too sometimes. But that's what the Israelites are like. The Jews are like that at this point in history. And of course, we're like that too very often as well. We're reminded of this in Nehemiah's prayer as well. In Nehemiah chapter 1. We see in Nehemiah chapter 1. Remember, I pray, verse 8, the words that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though some of you were cast out to the farthest part of the heavens, yet I will gather them from there and bring them to the place which I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. Now these are your servants and your people, whom you have redeemed by your great power, by your strong hand. So again, reminding them, yes, we were just brought out of this the punishment, and now we are dealing with these sins and these struggles right now. We see it again in the covenant declarations in Nehemiah chapters 9 and 10, which that's a lot, so I won't read that right here. But you can read that on your own time. Those fantastic chapters. And what Nehemiah tells the people as well when they violate the law in Nehemiah 13. Nehemiah 13, verse 26. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin by these things? Yet among many nations there was no king like him, who was beloved of his God. And God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, pagan women caused even him to sin. Should we then hear of your doing all this great evil, transgressing against our God by marrying pagan women? In other words, are you better than Solomon, who was such a great king? You don't fit that. And yet, you think you can resist the temptations that a pagan wife might bring to serve other gods? God just proved in the 70 years of captivity, just proved that he meant what he said when he had gave the curses for disobedience in the Old Testament law. We can see them, Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28, 29. We see the curses for disobedience in those chapters. And he shows, yeah, I mean it. I said these things 1,000 years ago or so. I mean it. I meant it. Look, you were just in captivity for these things. And yet you still won't believe. You still won't obey. We need to recognize that there are consequences for us too if we fall away. We just read in Hebrews chapter 10 last week or the week before last, I believe. In Hebrews chapter 10, verses 26 through 31, what that is, right? If we sin willfully, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a fearful expectation, right? For fiery indignation, fiery judgment. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God, we see in verse 31. So let us remember the covenant. Let us remember the consequences of breaking that covenant. But also, the last remembrance. Remember me for good. Nehemiah uses this phrase 4 times in his book, in Nehemiah. The first time, it was because of how fair he was while he was governor in his day-to-day actions. We see this in Nehemiah chapter 5 and verse 19. Chapter 5, verse 19 shows his time as a governor. Well, not 19, but 14 through 19 shows his time as governor. And toward the end of that, it says, remember me, my God, for good, according to all that I have done for this people. I've been a good governor, dear Lord. Remember me for these things. The next 3 are after he left and came back. He left for a period of time, we're not sure how long, went back to Persia, and then he comes back and he finds the place a mess. And in chapter 13, he does his best to set that right. he remembered the covenant. He feared the consequences, Nehemiah did, and he corrected the people who had gone astray. The first mention is when they had begun neglect, or they had been neglecting the priesthood. They were neglecting the priest. They weren't following what the law had to say when it came to tithing, when it came to providing for them. He found the priests were involved in working. And of course, in working the field. And they weren't supposed to be working the field. They were supposed to be working in the temple. And yet, the reason why they had to is because they couldn't provide for themselves anymore. The people weren't providing for them. And so he is upset by this. And so in verse 14, he sets that right. He says, "Remember me, O my God, concerning this, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for its services." For the house of his God, for the temple. He was cleansing the temple from the wickedness that had been going on in there at this time, and he was wanting to make sure that its services, the people who serve as the temple, the Levites, were well taken care of. The next was when the people were neglecting the Sabbath. They were neglecting the Sabbath. They were disobeying what God had to say when it came to resting on the Sabbath day, which was a law at this time. And in verse 22, he finishes that up. And in the latter part of that verse, he says, "Remember me, O my God, concerning this also, and spare me, according to the greatness of your mercy." And finally, it was after all, setting aright the pagan marriages we see in chapter 13. These pagan marriages continue to be a problem. They continue to be a problem even after Ezra 10, and he sets that right. And in chapter 13, verse 31, the last verse, he finally says, "Remember me, O my God, for good." He wants to be remembered for good. So remember the covenant, remember the consequences, and remember me for good. As we see, Ezra and Nehemiah, they set the stage for what we call the intertestamental period, the period that takes place in between the last inspired word around 400 BC or so, at least 432, as we see with the end of Nehemiah's governorship. Maybe a little bit after that, when he goes and comes back, so around 400 BC, up until the time when inspiration comes again in the time after Pentecost. And of course, we see that there's John the Baptist. He comes and he's the prophet at that time to prepare the way for Jesus. And so we see that is the case as well. When Scripture is being written again, sometime in 50 BC or AD 50, I think, is when some of the earliest things were written. So it begins setting the stage here for the period of the time period that we see later in the time of Jesus. And I think we begin seeing the prominence of the scribes and perhaps the seeds that birthed the Pharisees with the person of Ezra. You know, there are a lot of attitudes that they have that prevail today in terms of studying the Old Testament and studying the law and learning and how they viewed these things. We can look at that and say, "Oh, that's how they viewed that. That's how we should view it." And we can point to how they interpreted the law and how they saw that this is exactly how we ought to do these things. So reading such things is essential for our understanding of the Scriptures, how they got from the kings to captivity and to return to the land. And if we understand this, we'll know that all the prophecies that talk about their return to the land are talking about this time period, not some future time period like for us it's the past. But you know, a lot of people will say, "Oh, all these prophecies, they talk about 1948." No, they don't. They talk about this, the return to the land here at this point with Zerubbabel and his people, and continuing on as we see in Ezra and Nehemiah. We see the perseverance through adversity in these books. And this is definitely an example for us to follow. We don't face the same kind of opposition that they did back then. We personally, usually, I mean, there may be a case here or there, but typically, no, we don't. But there will always be some opposition if we are doing God's will. And we need to be encouraged through all that. Whether it be from outside or perhaps even from inside. We need to persevere. We need to overcome. That's the point of these books and why we ought to study them. And all that begins with obedience to the gospel. And I believe everyone here who is accountable has obeyed that gospel, and that's a wonderful thing. And I pray that we will continue to be faithful to our God, so that we can have that home in heaven with Him one day, and we can persevere as Ezra persevered, as Nehemiah persevered through the struggles, through the opposition that they both faced during their time governing and helping God's people. Let us serve God and persevere. If you have a need this evening, please come forward as we stand and as we sing.